Hey, everybody, and welcome to the third installment of the ConnectWise Incubator series, this one on development strategy. So my name is Mike Zorno. I'll be your host and guide for this session as well. Today, our guest is Bill Stucklin, who's going to share his insight and experiences on how to create a winning development strategy to speed up your time to market within creating integrations to ConnectWise. So today we're going to be answering questions on if you should insource or outsource your development. And our goal with these sessions is to really inform emerging startups, MSPs, anyone with an idea or a vision of creating a new product and integration into ConnectWise products on how to navigate, leverage ConnectWise through these sessions on finding your product market fit, your development and product management strategy. And we've got some great future sessions coming up on managing finances and go-to-market. So please join us for those sessions as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Bill Stucklin, the CTO for MSP Plus OS. Bill, welcome.
Hi, thank you, Mike. Appreciate you having me on today. It'd be great.
Absolutely. So in the last two sessions, as I mentioned, we've gone over a few different things with the business model canvas on finding your platform product market fit and also on creating a product management strategy. So utilizing those two workbooks on being able to put your idea to paper, be able to share with your team, be able to have, that single piece of paper that kind of gives you that vision and know where you're going and so the entire team that you have on board knows, what's the direction, what are we trying to solve for, and having all the ideas in one place that everyone can reference. So today we're going to be kind of going through that similar concept, but from a perspective from a dev strategy. Before we jump into that, Bill, introduce yourself. You've been in the ConnectWise ecosystem for a long time yourself. How did you get started and where did you go? Where are you now?
Yeah, for sure. So Bill Stucklin, I'm currently CTO of MSP Plus OS. I think the gray hair kind of shows the amount of time that I've been kicking around here. I got started as an MSP in the early 2000s. I believe around 2005 was when we first signed up and started using ConnectWise and built our MSP over the next decade, really leveraging the ConnectWise platform and the tools. And then after about 10 years in business, we decided to start a consultancy to help other MSPs with the tool set. And in the early days, one of the things that we had talked about with a lot of the great folks at ConnectWise was the integration side of things. So it wasn't just about helping people use the tools, but also to participate and really grow a community about people wanting to integrate into the platform. And that was something, we have always focused on the tools. Previous company was called Stack Advisors, for some of you who've been around a bit. And we really wanted to focus around the tools and building those integrations. And we've continued to do that over the last 12 years up until the beginning of this year, when we merged together with 4 other companies to create MSP Plus OS, but continuing to do integration work, both for ourselves, our easy deploy product, as well as helping other ISVs. So this is really kind of exciting. I appreciate you inviting me on, Mike, because it's something that, we've done a lot of over the last 10, 12 years. And I hope that I can really share some insight.
Yeah, absolutely. Bill and I met about probably 6 or 7 years ago when I was on the Invent team. So working with a lot of our vendors on creating integration, one of the questions they'd always come to us right away with is, who can help us? Because, we have our own piece of software. We're not experts on the ConnectWise side. Like, who can help us create this integration? And Bill was always, gracious enough to accept the calls to see if it was going to work, to be able to work with those other ISVs on creating integration into ConnectWise products. So let's jump into some of the how-tos and what to do, what not to do in that process. So you kind of went through your background of how you created your own products and provide development services for other ISVs. But what's your philosophy around building a development strategy, either internally for your own product or for an ISV?
Yeah, I think most ISVs and even maybe an MSP that's looking to get into creating their own product, they have to have some level of experience within development, right? So I think going into creating an integration with zero insight into development, you're setting yourself back, right? You need to have some familiarity with development. What's valuable is that having that experience allows you to really progress as far as it comes to identifying the product, the market fit, and then get into the actual development piece. And I know from this session, we want to really try to talk about what it is that you need to focus on, from the development strategy. And I think one of the key things, Mike, that we've talked about and that we've always seen is those foundational pieces of identifying what is the product and what does an integration look like. You had mentioned that in the previous session, you talked about getting to that MVP. And I think some of the things that we'll talk about today, when I look at how you go into development, the key pieces you need, both from the product fit as well as the resources, have to start early in that process. When you move to this point, you have your MVP identified, but you have to have some technical insight to really create that MVP as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the two previous sessions were important around creating that product market fit, finding that value prop of how you're going to differentiate yourself within the ConnectWise ecosystem. But I think this one is, extremely important in being able to put all those pieces together, because you may have a great idea, but being able to execute it from a development standpoint is certainly one of the things that can trip people up. I've worked with a ton of vendors over time, and there's a few different things. So, what we have on screen here is this business model canvas of, here's the different things that you need to think about as you go through the development process that we're going to talk through today with Bill. So, I think one of the things of, how do you pick the right resources, define roles, responsibilities, especially as that first question comes up: should I insource or should I outsource this development of the integration into ConnectWise?
Yeah, and I think this is really, really important to touch on, because there are a number of different resources involved, right? You have not only the internal team that has created your own software or your own tool that you're looking to integrate, but then you also have to understand that, you're going from, even if it's API to API, you're going into a product that maybe you don't fully understand the API pieces of it. I think you also need to take into consideration architecture, right? And that can come early on in identifying the MVP, but you need to understand where you're going to build this platform, how you're going to secure it, how you're going to monitor it, how, what those costs associated with it are. So that technical resource typically is not the developer itself, right? Somebody needs to kind of sit in that role as the DevOps, needs to understand, hey, are you building this in AWS? Are you building this in, Azure? And how are you going to architect this? That's good for input. Now, obviously, they're not necessarily the folks that are going to create the product. When you get to that actual product creation, that's where you need the developers. You need a project, manager or a product manager if you're using the agile style of development. But then you also need that expertise around where you're integrating to. And this is something that, we really helped a lot of early, integrations into the platform, providing that full stack of services. I think what we're seeing now, and I think, Mike, where there's value, especially for a lot of the folks that are coming into the event program right now, is to understand that you have an inherent knowledge of your tool, and that the people that develop your tool can be incredibly valuable in helping create an integration. But you also need somebody that is going to understand and be knowledgeable around the ConnectWise APIs, and whether you're going into a specific product or you're looking to go into the platform itself and integrate with multiple products. Understanding it's not just reading an API document, but you really need to understand that data set, right? What is that data that is moving from one spot to another, and how does that data move within the ConnectWise product? And that's something that we certainly have seen a lot more involvement in, is really collaborating with people around that SME component, right? Being the knowledge experts around what the ConnectWise API is. I know that you and the event program provide resources for folks to be able to get at that. But I think it's something really important to consider when you get into the development is, I may know one side of it, but I have to understand the other side and understand how that product works for my integration to actually do what it's supposed to do from an integration standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen that time and again, especially on the automate side of, someone's an expert in backup or security, but they don't know how automate works. They don't know that, this is how the standards of pushing out an agent, this is how you monitor, and being able to have that collaborative approach between, an ISV and someone that's an expert on the ConnectWise side really gives you a leg up on competition, and just being able to get to market quickly, and being able to collaborate on that. And it's I think truly a question of, does your company have the infrastructure, the people, the tech stacks, and most importantly, I'd say the time to achieve the goals of integration in there. So you mentioned getting dev resources involved early in the project. How early do you get different resources involved, and then who gets involved when you start doing that requirements analysis?
Yeah, and I think that's one thing where a lot of times we'll have those early conversations with folks that you'll introduce us to, or reach out to us, where they're like, hey, I want to create an integration. What do I need to know? And sometimes those folks don't even understand exactly how an MSP works. So there's a little bit of that education that comes in there. But having a technical resource, I think when you talk about sort of what the integration should do, I don't know if you necessarily need a technical resource at that point. But when you start to get that next layer down, and I'm not talking about individual user stories and acceptance criteria and all of the things that you go into, that MVP. But once you start to say, hey, I need this data set to go here, and let's just take something like ticket data as a very easy example. We know that ticket data is going to have a person, probably a configuration or a device, and then the issue, and maybe some background information, logging information. Depending on your product as an ISV, where does that information live? It doesn't always live in the same spot, right? It's not always assembled the right way. And when you go into ConnectWise and to the products, it's not necessarily pushed in that single, stack of file. You have to, or data, you have to move that stuff around. Having a technical resource be able to say, oh, well, customer information is stored here, and ticket information is stored here, and log files are stored here, that can complicate how you assemble that data to be able to push or pull it into the ConnectWise product. So I think it's important to have that input early on when you're talking about what the integration should use. When you start to finalize that MVP, I also think it needs that technical review so that they can say this is and isn't possible. And that it's not just on your side as an ISV or somebody creating the integration. You need to understand, is there a place for that data to go naturally into ConnectWise, or do we need to map it, or do we need to look at some type of custom data field?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as that process gets started, when do you start creating those user stories and acceptance criteria?
Yeah, I think typically when we do it, we go through a discovery. Like when we work with an ISV, or when we went to work on our own, easy deploy product, it was something that we had an idea. We knew inherently what that process should be like, right? How we wanted those things to flow. When I talk with an ISV, that discovery piece actually happens prior to the determination of what the MVP is. Because a lot of times, if you have a great product as an ISV or even as an MSP, something you want to bring to market, there's a lot of stuff that maybe you want to do that isn't a great fit in that initial MVP. So identifying that stuff before the MVP is typically what we'll do as part of a discovery process. And again, with Agile style, what's great is you can lay all of that stuff out. You can create all of these user stories. You don't even have to get into the nitty-gritty. And then you can start to dissect and say, here are the pieces that fit together. So when you get into the development side, you have those identified and laid out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, we're in that discovery, making sure we've got everything, laid out in front of us. So both sides, if you're outsourcing your development, everyone's aware of, this is what we're going to do. This is what you're going to do. Once that's kind of discovered, how do you create that overall schedule of development and critical path of creating, an actual flow of this is how development's going to work. This is our, our main task and our approach of how we're going to utilize it.
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right? Is how long will it take? When can I get this thing to market? And I think that, not to not give an answer, but it does depend on the complexity around it. I think what's important is, to understand anybody that has done development or an API style development, one product to the other, getting that basis to be able to authenticate should be fairly straightforward, right? I think the standards are there. I think that the APIs that ConnectWise is using and continuing to improve and document, like that stuff is there. So being able to do that authentication and the connection is valuable, or is there. It makes it simple. When you start to get into the layers of what your integration is doing, that's where you can really see that timeline expand. And again, it's something we try to help folks, understand. Is this a 3-month integration or a 6-month or a 9-month integration based on the complexity? We know that there's some low-hanging fruit and some of the simple stuff that you get into when you start to look at pushing data in. One-way sync is a lot simpler or one-way push is a lot simpler than doing an actual data sync, because once you start to do that sync, that's where you can really extend the timeline by having to map components, right? So that you can bring things back and forth. This is where a lot of times I'd say, Mike, that identifying that MVP is what's going to make this, again, a viable product, because then you can go and continue to build and expand on it. So what's the minimum that the MSP needs to be able to use this integration, right? Because they're still going to use your tool or your product. They're still going to use ConnectWise. But what is that minimal piece that ties it in? And I think if you look at a timing standpoint, to get back to your original question, right? That is something that can happen within a few months if you have the resources, if you've identified what it is, and if you have the knowledge around that API, you can get something out fairly quick that will be usable by a small user base while you continue to build that up. What I can say is there are some folks out there that we continue to work with who have been working on improving their initial integration and continuing to improve this integration for years, 6, 7, 8, 9 years, right? It is an evolution of these integrations. And if you have a good footprint, you have to continue to innovate, but you also have to pay attention to what ConnectWise is doing to be able to leverage a lot of those features. So it's easy to get in a few months, but you got to commit to really continuing to grow it. And I think that's one of the biggest pieces of advice I'd give from this is your development needs to continue. It can't just stop.
Yeah. Yeah, I see that as well. I think one of the things we've always discussed in the past is kind of finding what is that common piece of data that flows through the integration. So if you're some sort of monitoring alerting type solution, you're most likely going to create a ticket within PSA. Like you said, I can get that integration up fairly quickly. I can create a ticket. Hey, the ticket went to a service board, someone addressed it, but being able to close that alert on your side because it's already been addressed within ConnectWise, and then adding the complexities of our products of, well, you have a ticket, that's great, but we should probably add a configuration so we know what computer or server or network device that this is affecting, and being able to find triggers to do something with that data and take the next action. I think that's some of the things you've always impressed upon me of, like, let's find what are the minimums and being able to take the next steps.
Yeah, and I think that's a really valuable point, is that, when you say, how do I attack this, right? How do I start this development? Where do I begin, right? Well, you got to make the connection, and then you got to say, well, what is that key piece of data? And what is that data that actually flows through the integration now and in the future, right? So if it is centric on a user, then that user data is the piece that's going to continue to flow through. If it's centric on a device or some other type of alert, like getting that data in properly and making sure that it exists within the ConnectWise platform in the right way, that is really key, because then you can build on that. And you mentioned, Mike, triggers, right? Everybody wants to automate. And to automate, you got to have that data in there so you can build the trigger to then take action on. And that action is where the automation actually takes place. So, getting that core piece in there when you get your MVP, when you start in your development, that's always what I suggest you attack first, right? Authentication, table stakes, but getting in there and saying, does my data flow properly throughout the ConnectWise once it's put in there? That's really key to making a successful integration.
Yeah. All right, so we've got an integration, we've mapped it out, we know what our MVP is, everything's hunky dory. We've got, hey, it's January 1st, we're going to launch this thing. Well, then development happens. So how do you incorporate flexibility into the dev process?
Yeah, and another one of these great questions. So, we've gone and we do agile style, and so everything we do is based on sprint points. I think that when you look at how you lay out the timing on it, anybody that does agile knows that things get pushed, right? And sometimes things don't take as long as you anticipated. Through our experience, we can judge how, again, estimate how long or how many sprint points something will actually take to create. I think what's really important, and one piece of advice that I always recommend to vendors is they'll call me in August and say, hey, we want an integration by IT Nation Connect in November. We're on track, right? It's like, well, hold on. maybe not. And so I think it's important that if you have, look, the events are key and really important to being able to launch a product and talk about the integration, right? That's such an important thing for growth of your integration or your product. But you have to be realistic that you can't jump into this fresh in 3 months and have something ready to show at the event. So if you want something, you got to plan that out, and you got to give yourself a buffer, because anybody that's done development knows things will come in, or you think you have the right user criteria. You get your early MSP partner, and they go, nope, this doesn't do anything for us. We always have to go back to your portal to do stuff, right? So there's some components to that. You have to be flexible, and Agile gives you that ability. But I think having a realistic expectation of a 3-month turnaround to be ready to present at a show, you got to be a little more practical than that.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that we hear quite a bit is I want the short runway. I want to get it out there, but having a successful launch is part of that as well. So being able to incorporate some flexibility into the dev process key. And I think the other part that kind of flows with that is risk management. How often are you updating the project plan? What's your coordination with yourselves and the ISV? How does that typically work?
Yeah, so we using Agile, we have we have our sprints, we have our backlog, we have all of those user stories created before we go into it, and we modify those as necessary. We would always do weekly production meetings, typically an hour, where all the stakeholders would be there, not just the Agile team, right? So that we would have the business unit, the channel. A lot of times we were working directly with the channel people because they're trying to build this channel out. They would all participate in this, so everybody knew where things were going. Because I think it's important that while we're talking about the development piece of this, we have to recognize that sales and marketing is on the other side trying to figure out when they can talk about the integration. So those production meetings, again, there would be the daily stand-ups that the team would have just to say, here's what we're working on. But those production meetings, especially early on, every week we would have those to update where things are at. What are we working on? We ran into a problem. Or when we at MSP Plus OS are participating in those as a subject matter resource, we still encourage that. And we'll come in and be able to answer a lot of those questions about API or how does that data set work, et cetera. Weekly for sure in the beginning. I think I would typically recommend that those stay weekly until your MVP is out. Then you can pull back, right? Because then you have the foundation and you've gotten through a lot of the sort of potential technical issues. You have something that's functional, something that people are using, something that you should be gathering feedback from out. Maybe some of the stakeholders don't participate anymore, but early on, it is critical for all of the business units to really understand where this is coming from.
You mentioned a few different stakeholders between, the technical team, sales, marketing, et cetera. In your experience, who's in charge? Who's making the decision of this is when we go, this is when we launch?
Yeah, so I think all of the early integrations that we worked on, it was the channel manager. These initiatives seem to come from either somebody building a channel or as an initiative from the channel, which is very interesting because the budget from that would be from either marketing or channel and not really from dev. And pulling in a dev resource was always a challenge because those dev resources are allocated to creating their own product, not necessarily creating the integration. What I think is really important is whether it's, somebody like the CTO or the CEO or the VP, head of sales, whatever it is, maybe they don't need to be on all of those meetings, but they need to be in the loop and they need to support whoever that person is. Again, typically it was the channel manager until the integration was established, and then that moved either into the regular development cycle. So a product owner would be assigned for the integration and other integrations, or it would stay with the channel person, but then the allocation of budget would shift over, outside of the channel or the marketing expense to that. Typically, when we would go in to consult, right? So we wouldn't necessarily be writing the code itself. There was always a product manager, a product owner on the ISV side that would really run the flag up if there was a decision that needed further approval. But typically that product owner would be given the authority to make decisions about the integration, that we would help them, either understand what that would take to execute on, or if we were, creating the code, we would then say, here's where we estimate this from a sprint standpoint.
Yeah. All right, so we've gone through most of the dev process. Let's say we've got that owner. We've gone through our weekly meetings. Hit some humps and bumps along the way, but we're getting close to releasing. How is quality control going to be implemented and measured before we kick this out the door?
Yeah, and this has always been an interesting one, especially in a collaborative type of engagement, because you have internally as an ISV, you have people that do your own QA around your product, that understand your product, that maybe, communicate with their community around it. When we come in, we understand the integration, we understand how it should work within ConnectWise. We perform, our own level of QA on it. But I think what's really important in this, Mike, is to look at what's the bigger picture. Who is actually going to use it? And if you're looking at going to market without an MSP that is going to be an alpha and a beta and an early release and an MVP tester, you're missing it, because you're going to deliver something that may or may not actually be functional for an MSP in the real world. And we always, early on, when we would start development or start consulting around helping somebody develop, we would say, get your community person. MSPs probably asked you about this, which is why we're working on this. Start the conversation now about getting them into the conversation and getting them prepared to, hey, we'd like you to test something, or we'd like to even just show you the wireframe. Is this going to meet your expectations? It's critical that the MSPs give you that level of QA. Give them some free stuff, whatever you got to do. Send them a bottle of bourbon, but get them to help you vet out that integration before you try to push it out to the rest of the market.
Yeah, absolutely key. One of the things I've seen in my years in the Invent team was being able to get that QA beta testing done with real live MSPs and being able to get that feedback of this is how we'd want to use it. And it's certainly something to say of, get your cheerleaders to do it, but also get people that may want the integration, but may not be as happy to get that feedback, get that information of this is how we use it, because MSPs operate differently. You've got your small startups, your, balance builders, then you have your empire builders that are, very process oriented, and, they may have different needs, which requires different development capabilities of, oh, well, I need to map it to the service board and then do X, Y, Z with it. Whereas somebody else is like, oh, just throw it wherever, we'll figure it out. And I
think that's key. That's really key. And, anybody that's worked with, QA or a professional QA person knows that mindset is very different than others, right? And that's not a dig. That's an important fact. But they think differently, and they're going based on that, acceptance criteria that you've created. I need it to function this way. Great, it's functioning that way. Well, what happens if there's an error in the data? Or what happens as you say, like, well, I don't want it to go to a server, specific service boards. I just want to dump it in a bucket and have somebody go through it manually, right? QA, it's really hard for somebody that is not in an MSP day-to-day to provide the level of QA necessary for that function to be identified and validated.
Yeah. All right, Bill, we've made it. The MVP is out. Like, we're done. Dev is over. I don't have to do anything else, right?
Yeah, not so much. Not so
So,
much.
so what are those ongoing resources that you need for, bug fixes, upkeep, phase
Yeah.
2, etc.?
So I think the one thing that I have certainly seen mistakes happen on these releases is that the support teams are not trained when MVP gets released. So
Mhm.
what happens is that that channel manager or maybe the product owner, they end up taking support calls because nobody else is up to speed on how it's supposed to work. And you certainly don't want your developers taking support calls. We know that just won't turn out well, right? So I think it's important to have that prepared. Here's how it is. Do some training internally for your support team. Even if they can't solve it, they can have the conversation and collect the info you need to do the bug fix. So that's one of the things that I certainly see is people making mistakes on. The other one is you can't build it and let it run, right? It's just like an automation, but even deeper and layered and technical. You can't just say, great, we got it, let's go make a bunch of money on it, right? You have to continue to be available for any kind of bug fixes that people have. You need to have, and again, you may not want to necessarily have a full-time resource dedicated to it, but somebody needs to have this be their priority when the work comes in. If you're going agile style, I promise your MVP is going to be leaving gaps that you want to do as the ISV or that the MSPs are going to ask for. And so you need to have that ongoing, iteration. Those same people can work on bugs, you can build feature and bug fixes into releases, but I just see so many times where people make a mistake that they build it and they think, great, the integration's there and that's going to drive the business. You can't do that in this ecosystem. You have to be able to continue to support it. The feedback, MSPs are very verbose, and we know this, and they're going to give feedback about what they want or how they want something to work. That's incredibly valuable information that you have to work into that ongoing development. So anybody that's going to do an integration, don't think of this as like a 6-month initiative, right? This is a commitment to continue going on. You can determine after you get through MVP, after you get through that second and tertiary list of features, how much you want to commit to it. But you have to have a good 20-30% of a resource available that understands this and has a resource, whether it's an external resource like us or working with the Invent program. They have to be able to have a resource to understand how to fix things, especially when ConnectWise is making changes and continuing to evolve their product.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to have every integration work forever, but we've got to make improvements on our side that may slightly change API functionality, things like that are gonna cause slight updates to be needed down the road to be able to ensure that we're all doing the best for the MSP community.
Well, absolutely, but there's also new features and new functionality and new products, right? And I think that's the other thing to consider is that ConnectWise didn't just build a piece of software and now they're just leaving it. You guys are continuing to evolve that platform, and the future is incredible. And if you create an integration, you have to be ready to jump on those features when they come because MSPs are going to use them as soon as they're available.
Yep, absolutely. So the integration is built. We've got a plan to keep keep it alive and improve it. What else is necessary to be successful in the ConnectWise ecosystem besides just purely having an integration?
Yeah, and this goes a little bit outside of the development conversation, but I do think it's important, or at least for me, it's an important thing to express is that, I mentioned you can't just build an integration and let it drive adoption of your product from the ConnectWise ecosystem. You need to participate. You need to be there. You need to communicate. You need to invest in the marketing and the engagement with the overall ecosystem at events, at webinars, at any kind of participation you can get. It's really important. And I've seen 2 vendors kind of take different paths, and I've seen one that the integration was part of their overall investment strategy into the ConnectWise ecosystem, and they became hugely successful, and they're still successful today. I've seen another vendor who said, we're just going to build an integration. They didn't do any sponsorships. They didn't go to the events. They didn't have a booth. They didn't do any breakouts, etc. And it fell flat. They had a few people that used it, and those were the ones that asked for it in the first place. After about 3 years, they ended up circling back and taking the proper approach, which is to invest in not just the integration, not just the development, not just the support of the integration, but invest in participating in the ecosystem. And it's so important, again, not necessarily development, but you have to remember that development supports that effort. The integration supports that effort, but they can't do it on their own.
Yeah, absolutely. I think having that owner that understands those different avenues you have to take between not just, hey, this is what table stakes are for development, but this is what we need to get it out there, gather feedback, enable our internal teams, enable MSPs to utilize it so everyone can be successful and really get the most out of these two products working together. I think putting those things into that single pane of glass and being able to have that those the superior integrations that are going to take you above and beyond your competition and really create that delightful experience of using two products together.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really key.
I think it's important to point out too, like when you go, like let's say you go to IT Nation Connect and you have a booth, bring your product owner, bring a technical resource. They don't have to be a developer, but bring somebody that can talk about your integration at a technical level, because the ConnectWise ecosystem is about improving everybody's lives, right? About improving the product. And I have always found either with a client of mine there or having our own booth is that there is always somebody that's going to come and talk at a technical level or a product level, and they want your product to get better because it makes their lives better. And that give and take is really valuable. And if you have just a sales and marketing person there, you're going to lose stuff, right? You're going to lose that opportunity to gain the insight. And that's, of course, like on top of the opportunity to go be with all the great ConnectWise folks as well. But, and there's opportunities there as well. So it's important to not just send a sales and marketing. Bring somebody that understands the integration, right? And can talk about the integration, because it's invaluable feedback that is impossible to solicit from some of these folks outside of an event.
Yeah, absolutely. And no offense to all the sales and marketing people watching.
Yeah, not at all. There's a lot of value that you get from it as well. And if you're technical and you do sales, then you're the unicorn and you're great. You can run the whole thing on your own, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Bill, really appreciate all your insight on the dev strategy today. So, as we've had on screen is the development canvas. So being able to take a lot of the concepts we went through today and answer those questions for yourself. Is this going to be beneficial for our company? Do we have the necessary infrastructure, people, tech stacks, time to achieve this internally? Should I go consult with someone externally where, they may not do the development for us, but they can at least consult. So whether it's through the Invent program or MSP Plus OS, being able to give that expertise of, hey, this is what you need to understand about the ConnectWise APIs. This is how they work. Here's the gotchas. Here's the additional, things that you need to include in the integration, or, purely outsource as well. So a lot, three options. They have to determine what's going to work best for you, and it's what's going to be most beneficial for yourselves and your end customers. So, utilizing that, everyone watching, feel free to take a screenshot, email me, send something in the comments. I'm happy to get that over so you can utilize that in your journey in creating your product or integration with ConnectWise. Bill, any words of wisdom to leave us with?
Yeah, I think I probably harped on it enough here, but this ecosystem has been very pivotal in my personal and professional career, and a lot of it has been that collaboration and that give and take. And I think it's great, Mike, what you're doing here, sharing this knowledge. And I'll offer anybody that wants to reach out to me on LinkedIn and just have a chat. I'm happy to share experience. It's not always easy to try to get everything in one of these webinars, but I will say that any integrator that I have worked with has had success in this ecosystem because they've invested in it. And I think there's a lot of value, and there's a lot of people that want to share. And if I was to go do any integrations first, I know where I'd start. That would be with ConnectWise.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate your time today, Bill, and join us next month. We'll have another great session on go-to-market strategies. So until then, take care.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
See you, Bill.